All right, we're going to get rolling.
They helped create an economy that was completely addicted to cheap money.
You need to buy savings bonds or something. You need to be way, way, way out of this space.
I subscribe to Miss Piggy's rule of money management. Always manage to have more money, you know what I mean?
It wasn't but 2 years ago that everybody was saying China's economy was going to be bigger than that of the United States. It's gone in the exact opposite direction.
So we're going to jump right in. Welcome to VRIC Media, the most trusted voice in metals and mining. I'm here with Matthew Piepenburg, partner at Von Greyers, previously Matterhorn Asset Management. Matthew, it's great to have you back on the program.
Oh, it's thrilled to be back, as always. Thanks for having me again.
Looking forward to chatting with you and having you in Vancouver. You'll be at the Vancouver Resource Investment Conference, January 19th and 20th in Vancouver, British Columbia. Over 80 keynote speakers, 2 days, jam full of content and investment opportunities. Tickets right beneath this piece of content, so check that out. It's coming up real quick. We're like 6 weeks out. Can you believe that? It's bonkers.
That's crazy.
I'm looking forward. So look, there's a handful of directions I want to go with you today, Matthew. And let me just start with one big question, and then I'm just going to pull on some threads. So front and center for you right now, macro, what are you most focused on?
I mean, again, it's all the things we talk about just getting I sound negative, and it's just all the major forces seem to be getting more alarming, more concerning. And this has nothing to do with just an election. I'm not talking about left versus right. I'm talking about the major forces. Obviously, debt, geopolitics, inflation, currencies. It's madness right now in a lot of ways. I mean, we've got anarchy in Syria now. You've got Turkey supporting the U.S., basically the first NATO country. Turkey's a NATO country. It's really the first time a real open kind of proxy war between NATO and the West, with Turkey supporting this. And, whenever there's anarchy in Syria, that's always a possible humanitarian crisis. You've got, billions, hundreds of billions still going to the Ukraine. VRIC is going into Russia. It's a bloodbath. I think it's an avoidable war. I thought it was an avoidable war. I think the sanctions have backfired. I think it was the worst foreign policy decision America's made in a long time. You've got Biden trying to escalate this war before Trump comes in to try and solve it. Whether he can or can't is debatable. You've got here in Europe, where I am, Jay, I mean, look, you've got coalitions breaking down in Germany, in France, in the UK. We've just lost a prime minister. We've got lots of inflation and economic problems that really don't make the headlines always in the West and are not fully understood, but I see it on the streets here. You've got a recession in the U.S., in my opinion, already here versus a ripping Pavlovian Fed centralized markets. And you've got Trump, love him or hate him, he's a major disruption in the backdrop of a highly levered world. So a lot of change is coming. So there's new changes, but there's old problems that aren't necessarily solvable in one term. And I'll just stop at this point. I've said for years the same thesis that I look at historically and financially. When you have a debt crisis, 36 trillion in public debt in the U.S., but everywhere in the world, we're 330 trillion globally, outpacing GDP 3-1. When you have a debt crisis, that always leads to eventually some type of financial crisis, always a currency crisis, which usually means an inflation crisis, which is very painful for the man on the street. When you have inflation, you usually get social unrest. And social unrest is almost, without exception, followed by some type of extreme centralization and or even worse, war. And whether you have a peace deal with Lebanon and Israel and then an escalation in Syria or what we're going to do in the East, I worry, and I really hope I'm wrong, I hope war doesn't become the final distraction from the elephant in the room, which is really poorly managed governments, poorly managed foreign and domestic and monetary policies for years of postponing and delaying and extending and pretending at the expense of the currency and the inflation and the man on the street from just really bad policies and trying to postpone the debt ramifications that are already happening in a lot of ways and trying to be paid off in other ways. But I see a really volatile, polarized, and dangerous world. And I hope it doesn't lead to more military escalation, because, again, in a nuclear war, that's crazy. But we are seeing extreme signs of currency wars, as Rickard would say, his book that came out years ago. He's been very, I'll have to say, prescient in that, in foreshadowing a lot of the things that we're seeing playing out now. So the themes we've talked about for years are going to continue to play out. It's just a question of to what degree of madness and appalling consequences or happy endings or mid-happy endings we have, that's to be determined. But I hate to say it, as usual, I'm not the most optimistic person right now, sadly.
And most of the time, this is my belief, whoever's in the president's seat doesn't matter that much. I mean, the beauty of the U.S. Constitution is that it limits the power of any one man. It's beautiful.
Yeah.
This might be different. I mean, maybe today is a bit of an anomaly where a strong leader or a different leader in the American seat could actually make an impact geopolitically internationally. You mentioned a few of these hot wars. There's been this proliferation of conflicts over the last 4 years. Do you think any of that is correlated to the leadership style coming out of the U.S. and could a new leader coming in, a very different one, very outspoken one and brash, could that curtail people's ambitions a little bit on the global stage? What do you think?
I mean, I agree in a lot of ways, and I differ in certain ways. At 30,000 feet, I think, I'm very proud of the Constitution and the three branches of government that our founding fathers came up with and the ideals of our founding fathers. I think the Fed has become a dangerous and unconstitutional fourth branch of government, central banks in general. I also think the base layer incentives of major corporations, big government, big corporations, and the hidden government, the base layer incentives of the military, of the intel agencies, and the foreign policies that they direct that no one reads about in a Google search. And that's somewhat dark. They have a massive influence on policy that is really indifferent to who's in the White House. I think under the Biden administration, not meant to insult the integrity or the beliefs of Democrats who are listening, and I certainly have a lot of Democrat friends, you can't deny that there was a perception of weakness under Biden's mental state and who was really leading the country, not just in the last 10 minutes or the last few months, but in the last few years. I know I've said this before. When he came to the Democratic caucus 3 years ago, even then, when I was in Northern Virginia talking to people in D.C., they said I didn't understand a word he was saying. This was 3 years ago. And yet his press secretary, his vice president, his entourage said he was as sharp as a tack. That was simply not true. And so I think we knew that. The media didn't want to admit it. The entourage around him didn't want to admit it. That shouldn't be insulting. That shouldn't even be partisan. That should be a concern for everyone when our president is clearly lacking in some of the mental horsepower. And I think you could argue that the world did take advantage of that. We had a fiasco in Afghanistan. We had either a planned or indirect fiasco on our borders. I think we had a fiasco in weaponizing the U.S. dollar against Russia, a major nuclear state power in bed already with the BRICS. Even his former boss, Barack Obama, in 2015 said, don't weaponize a neutral world reserve currency. So who was making decisions? You could argue it was Biden. My guess is it really wasn't. And that's what scares me the most about the last 4 years. Who really was in charge? The Pentagon, at the cabinet, in the Oval Office. I'm sorry, I just don't really think it was Biden making varsity level decisions. To your point, Trump, as RFK Jr. said, he's an impolitical figure. He is definitely a force of personality. He is definitely not your typical politician. That's what so many find refreshing and terrifying about him. Depending on your bias or your concerns, there's no doubt that unlike 2016, he's coming with a much stronger agenda. You could say he has a learning curve. He's a little more cynical than he was about who he's going to pick to advise. I think he's picked a pretty good team around him. We could argue about that, but I think former Democrats who've become Republicans, whether that's a Kennedy or a Tulsi Gabbard or having Elon Musk there, love him or hate him, there's a pretty powerful team coming in. They're coming in with sharp knives. In a lot of ways, this goes to the history buff in me. Most people know who George Custer was. He was this general who was surrounded by Indians in 1876 and massacred at the Battle of Little Bighorn. But before that, he was a general in the Civil War, and he was incredibly successful as a general, incredibly brave. He was one of those strange soldiers who seemed to really enjoy combat, like couldn't wait to get on a horse and go into battle. I mean, most people, no matter how brave they are a little nervous. He actually seemed to get excited. In a lot of ways, Trump reminds me of a George Custer. Sometimes a fine line between the sublime and ridiculous. I mean, all the impeachment processes, all the lawfare against him, all the media against him, he just keeps coming back. Again, love him or hate him, you can't deny this force of personality, this almost desire to get into the mix, the art of the deal, whatever you want to call it, vanity, psychopathy, or genius, depending on your bias. But Trump is definitely different than Ronald Reagan. He's definitely different than any of the Bushes. He's certainly different than Biden. So, but he has that kind of Custer mystique to me, and that can be wonderful or it can be disastrous. It's to be determined. In a lot of ways, but in terms of the branches of government, at least for the first 2 years until the midterm, Trump has a majority in the House, the Senate. He's got a Supreme Court stacked with judges that Republicans have nominated, and he's in the White House. So whatever he does, whether it's genius or foolish, it's going to happen fast, and it's going to probably happen before the midterm. So he's going to work pretty quickly in the next 2 years. And so I think it does matter this time who's in the White House. And again, for some, it's wringing their hands. For others, it's a sigh of relief. I can understand both points, but I think we're definitely going to see some change. That's for sure.
Quick break here, guys. Today's episode is brought to you by Coppernico Metals. Now, regular viewers of my channel will be familiar with the entrepreneur behind Coppernico. His name is Ivan Bebek. Now, although a young man in this business, Ivan's already created tremendous value for his shareholders in the past, namely with Caden Resources, which he sold to Agnico Eagle, and Keegan Resources, which became a mine now owned by Galliano Gold. Now, Ivan has surrounded himself with expertise from BHP, Newmont, and BRIC on his board at Coppernico Metals. Check out coppernicometals.com. Now back to the interview. Yeah, I agree with you. And, I read that book, The Art of the Deal, when he was elected the first time because I wanted to understand who this guy was a little bit better. What was so interesting about it was that his mannerisms and style of communication have not changed at all since the mid 80s when he published that book. He's like, you want to walk into the room and say something crazy, throw everybody off balance, and then sneak in your real demand, and that's, it's a pretty savvy negotiating tactic, just the shock and awe. And already, as the elect, he's goading leaders like Prime Minister Trudeau. Oh, you don't like the tariffs? Well, become a state. Like, he just says the thing, as opposed to as opposed to the dance. And so I wonder if you're right. And I've watched his appointments with similar appreciation, I think, and struck me maybe that there's a massive advantage to having a 4-year term, then taking a pause, integrating what you learned, and coming back for your second term now with fresh eyes and experience. Do you think that he can make this guy campaigned on massive change, right? Department of Government Efficiency being a classic example. There's campaign, and then there's candidacy, right? There's presidency. Sure. They're different. Yeah. So your optimism level, Michael, on the ambitions of a department like the Department of Government Efficiency, do you think there's something, because if this is going to work, from my perspective, he's got to pain has to come first. Right? Like if the Doge department actually functions the way it was promised, it's going to cause a lot of near-term pain before something good comes out of it. Would you think that's a fair assessment? And what's your take?
Yeah, I think it's a fair assessment in a lot of ways. And I've said this before, it's cryptic, but, and I said this even before, I wasn't surprised by the result. I really wasn't. But I said, regardless of who was going to win when it was still up in the air, I didn't envy either when you're coming into the type of debt background that they're coming into, with 36 trillion in public debt, 100 trillion in combined household, government, and corporate debt. I mean, it's different in a lot of ways. I said it's kind of like being nominated the captain of the Titanic after the iceberg's been hit. You're going to get blamed for not having enough lifeboats no matter what. There's going to be casualties here. And, when Trump came into the White House in 2016, entitlements, interest on government debt, and military expenses was 65% of tax receipts. Well, now it's twice that much, so there's not a lot of wiggle room here. And in those same costs, entitlements, interest, and military was 75% of the budget, still 75% of the budget. So there's not a lot of wiggle room either. When you talk about the Department of Government Efficiency, I have no doubt that Trump and VRIC have massive capacity to create pink slips in the swamp, so to speak, of DC. Absolutely. They're talking about 75% layoffs across agencies, getting rid of the Department of Education. Again, love it or hate it, there's great optics to this notion of America's like a Soviet bureaucracy in DC. You feel it. On Route 66 or 495 going to Maryland or coming out of Northern Virginia, just this caravan of government agent kind of bureaucrats, many would say who do nothing. They would obviously argue differently, but the goal by our 250th birthday in 2 years with Doge is to shave 2 trillion off of the expenses. So, okay, that has fantastic optics. You have to fire a lot of people in DC to come up with that number. Yet, for every 25 basis point cut, you can cut 25 billion off of government interest expense. So you can do that also to get the Fed to cooperate. I think they will for other reasons. They're going to be cutting rates because they have to debase the currency. But these policies, he's coming in with an agenda. Like I've said, there's great optics and frankly some relief to see the fat cut in the swamp, as Trump has said. And Doge will do, I think, an aggressive blitzkrieg job in cutting fat. Whether you think it's good fat or bad fat, it's to be determined. But that will likely happen. I don't think he's not going to keep his promise there. I don't think Musk or Vivek want to go down and not keep their promise. There are consequences to it. Whether it's this Doge program, whether it's the tariffs, whether it's reshoring jobs, or even mass deportations of immigrants, whether you like them or not, those policies are inherently and highly inflationary, in my opinion. So in a lot of ways, Trump can get a lot of things he wants done. I think the one mistake he made, in addition to these promises, was promising that he would beat inflation. I think that if I had been an advisor to Trump, I'd have said, you have a lot of ideas. Don't say that out loud. Like George Bush when he said, read my lips, no more taxes. Or when his son got on an aircraft carrier and said, peace in Iraq. It was too soon. I think a lot of the programs he wants to do are inherently inflationary. I think he wants, and he said in the campaign, and now he wants a weaker dollar. Uncle Sam needs a weaker dollar. The rest of the world, which is $13 trillion in dollar-denominated debt, needs a weaker dollar. And yet, since he came in office, and despite the Fed cutting rates feverishly, the DXY has jumped from 103 to above 107. It reminds me a lot of Bush in 2001 when Greenspan was cutting rates feverishly. And yet, the DXY went from 108 to 121. In some ways, the bond market, more than the Fed, is determining the strength of the dollar right now. And he needs to debase the dollar. He needs to cut the dollar down. He needs to cut debt to GDP down. I don't see how he does that without an inflationary policy, whether it's at the Fed or whether it's with his own spending. I don't know. Even with cutting it at the DC level, that fat, there's still going to be $1 trillion deficits. And that delta has to be filled with mouse click money at the Fed. And frankly, and this is my personal belief, I'm all in favor of cutting some of the waste out of the swamp. But if Trump is really sincere and he's truly a maverick and he really wants to solve the problem in DC, he's going to have to start not with just the Department of Education or Agriculture and firing bureaucrats. He has to go after K Street. He has to go after the lobbying, the wolves of K Street, because that's the biggest threat to democracy. It's the biggest threat to the ideals of our founding fathers, this legalized bribery, whether that's APAC or whether that's rifles or whether that's big tech, big pharma, big government, big media. The Fed itself, to me, is a monopoly power. When I was in law school, the antitrust ideals of Clayton Act and the Sherman Act, these were important. We've got massive monopoly powers who are paying for influence, including, again, this is not about against crypto, but crypto was his major donor. And now we're talking about a Bitcoin strategic reserve or stockpiling. That should be a problem, I think, for all of us worrying about monopoly powers. And I think, the fact that 3 or 5 companies own our media completely, that's a major threat to democracy. I think that 3 to 5 companies, BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, have immense influence on our economics and also on our congressional voting patterns. I think big pharma is an anathema to good health. So all of these things, I'd rather see that swamp splintered into 1,000 pieces than just a bunch of 60,000 a year employees at some department in DC. So I think there's a lot more than just the optics of Vivek and Elon that need to be addressed and looked at hard. Of course, our media won't look at it. Our mainstream media won't look at these things at all because they're completely useless. But alternative media that isn't just emotional or quacky and looking for clickbait, alternative media that has smart conversations, whether they're on your platforms or others, that is a saving grace for the monopolization of information. Because, Rothschild said, if you give me the control of the money supply, I don't care who's in office. Now think about it. If you control the money and you control the information, that's power. And I hate to be dramatic, but Mussolini's definition of fascism is the perfect marriage of government and corporations. And whether that was under a red or blue administration, we've had that for far too long in America. too much big corporate influence over our politics. I would love to see that addressed squarely. I'd love to see Vivek and Elon with a Matt Taibbi on their team talking more about these problems, and we'll see. But there's a lot of optics. But long answer to short question. I think a lot of the things he's going to try, they're going to be inflationary. I have nothing against trying to reshore jobs to America and from the Midwest. From Canada, I've seen the Rust Belt get destroyed when we made the American dream made in China since 2001 and the WTO, when we said all our toasters will be bought by Chinese. Well, we forgot to say they'd be making our toasters, then sending them back to us. So millions of people lost their jobs in my backyard in Ohio and Michigan and Minnesota and the Midwest, Pennsylvania. I do think Trump is sincere about reshoring manufacturing. And so I'm all in favor of that. The irony is with tariffs, that's typically a protective measure to protect your manufacturing. But most of our manufacturing was sent out east and sent to South America and El Salvador and cut and sew products, or sent to Asia for tech or for manufacturing car parts. We've got to bring those companies and those industries back into the U.S. We can't just blame government on that. That was the C-suites of companies where the CEOs are paid by share price. They want higher margins. The best way to do that is cheaper labor. They sold the American dream out, and politics allowed it. So if his tariffs is a way to incentivize companies that have American flags that are manufacturing in China back into America, I'm all for it. The problem is that's painful in the short term. It's wonderful in the long term. I hope he realizes, and I hope the American people realize, there can't be a miracle in 2 years, and it can't be done cheap, and there's going to be cost to that. And we'll see how Trump can handle the austerity or the reality behind that, if he can be man enough to say it, like a fireside chat during the FDR era. I think if the people believe his motives are sincere, they may be willing to make some sacrifices. I think the best policy is an honest policy. I want all these things for America. They don't come free. They don't come cheap. We're going to have to expend. We're probably going to have to debase our currency to do these things. And, we'll see. But there's a lot of forces at play here.
I kept waiting for that messaging on the campaign trail, and not shocked that I didn't hear it. That, look, in order for us to make things better, we got to go through some pain. We have to make things a little bit worse. Everything you just mentioned, from tariffs, deportation, devaluing the dollar, reshoring industries, all of that's inflationary, right? At least initially, right? But you're not going to campaign on that. I mean, I get why it wasn't said on the campaign trail. I fully understand. You're in a popularity contest at that point. Now you're in office. Maybe you can say the real thing. I don't know. And your comments about alternative media, I feel like that's what won this election. The $900 billion budget for the Harris campaign versus $300 for Trump. But interesting stat is that YouTube is the world's #1 podcast platform these days. It surpassed Spotify and Apple iTunes. And during the campaign, Trump generated 142 million streams on podcasts on YouTube. Harris generated 4.2 million. So 142 million to 4, right? And it was just recognition of the value of independent media. One candidate really went hard into it, and the other really shielded herself from long form, organic content. Now, an event like that happens, and I think that shifts the landscape, because now the value of independent media skyrockets, money comes in, probably pollutes the motives, and we'll see a bunch of consolidation and maybe influence, right? To your points about I mean, you kind of said it without saying it. Washington is donor occupied territory. I mean, that's what it's become, right? So, so actually on that thread, you mentioned Vivek, Elon. This is kind of RFK's mandate, is to attack a lot of these major lobby groups. And, intuitively, I'm like, yeah, but it was just different lobby groups that got Trump elected, like the Bitcoin lobby group, for example. And so I can't really see them going anywhere. But do you think RFK can make a dent? He sure seems like he's attempting to and gearing up for one. What's your take, Matthew?
A lot of people criticize RFK. I think he exemplifies his uncle's notion of profiles in courage, this book that Jack Kennedy wrote when he was a senator, and he had Addison's disease, so he was stuck in a hospital. When he was at Choate and he was at Harvard, he was sick all the time. He was a prolific reader. He understood our founding fathers' principles. He understood the ideals. He wasn't necessarily a perfect man by any stretch of the imagination. But Kennedy wrote this famous book in the 50s called Profiles in Courage, which his dad probably helped publish and make a Pulitzer Prize-winning success. But nevertheless, it's a well-written book. And the whole theme of Profiles in Courage is to make decisions for your government and your country, and not for re-election, which is almost an oxymoron or an anathema to your average politician whose only real motive is re-election. I don't think RFK needed the money, needed the job, or needed the fame. I do believe and I know, and this sounds like a wanker thing to say, I know enough Kennedys from my background and my life in New England, and I certainly was a huge fan of Ted Sorensen. He was Kennedy's speechwriter. I met him when I was at Choate, where Kennedy went to high school, and I met him later in Boston, who wrote the speech, "Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country." He was a lawyer in New York. He was a brilliant man. I do think there was sincerity, despite all the flaws in Jack Kennedy and Robert Kennedy Sr. and in Robert Kennedy Jr. I see real courage in going after big fish. Certainly Robert Kennedy went after the mafia. You could argue that's what got him and his brother killed indirectly, between that and Dulles and the CIA and everything else. But I think Robert Kennedy Jr. is no fool. He's no ignoramus to history or to the ideals of America's founding fathers from Virginia to Boston. I think he sincerely wants to make America better and is indifferent to just what people think of him or whether he can get reelected or get more power. I think he has a sincere motive. Many would disagree. I think his take on Fauci was 100% correct. I thought that took huge courage, profiles and courage. He knew it. He got a lot of heat from his own family, who misunderstood him. From the press, obviously, they were galvanic. They just swarmed on him. But he blitzkrieged through that. He was like a battleship. He cut right through that. He stuck to his principles. That would make his father and his uncle very proud. Because, and to your point, he is also a lawyer. He's also smart about health, and he's not anti-vaccine. He was anti-untested, unproven vaccines at a massive layout with mathematically obvious consequences that they were neither safe nor effective. Again, something the media does not want to talk about years after the fact. But even while COVID was in the height of its, hysteria, in Great Barrington in Massachusetts, there were doctors from Stanford, Oxford, Harvard, who said there were real problems with this vaccine. This wasn't something you discovered later. It was deliberately ignored. And I'm not saying that every vaccine is bad or even that the COVID vaccines were deliberately meant to depopulate the world. But there was absolutely room for an inspirited, intelligent debate, which was not even allowed, which is another insult to the founding principles of our country. And I think, my jury vote went with RFK from the very beginning. This stuff was available to be understood. It just wasn't in the media in Europe or in the West or in the US, So that was appalling. So I think in a lot of ways Trump is sincere, whether you think he's a maniac, an egomaniac, a fraud, a showman, whether you think RFK is similar. I don't, but I understand people who do. I think their motives are sincere and more. It's certainly in RFK's case, I think it's a lot less about ego and more about genuine conviction. And I'll take genuine conviction even if I don't agree with it. I like genuine conviction. I don't think Fauci had genuine conviction. I don't think a lot of senators and congressmen, and certainly your talking head Ken and Barbie, prompt readers at media X, Y, or Z in the mainstream have no conviction. They're just paid spokesmen for a corporate board and a political party. That's not investigative journalism, left or right. So I'll take conviction, informed, intelligent debate, even if I don't agree with it, over fluff and cotton candy media and cotton candy policies and platitudes that no one believes in. And to your point, Joel Rogan did more for Trump than NBC, CBS, ABC, or CNN did for Harris. Because to your point, I think DC and certainly in London and the Parliament and the National Assembly in France, but in America, I think DC underestimated the intelligence of the average American. And I think it's the same thing in Canada with Trudeau and his counter arguments. You can get the support of a lackey media, but if alternative media brings in intelligent people, whether it's Jordan Peterson or Brett or Eric Weinstein or Russell Brand, more and more listeners are going to start looking at alternative opinions and significant facts. The facts are stubborn things, and those were completely ignored by the mainstream media for a generation. And this election showed that smarter, informed, minds can even disagree, but they can inform the public, and the public isn't stupid. The public can figure this out on their own, and the public has spoken, whether you like it or not. And Canada certainly has some issues there. I mean, you have a person like Trudeau, which is very similar to Macron or Olaf Scholz here in Europe. In France, they don't have even 30% of the public majority. They live by coalition governments.
Yeah.
There's something we should be debating about that. Whether you like Trudeau or not, that should be discussed. You have a democracy that doesn't really represent the voice of the majority. And again, tack onto that lobbying and big corporations, that to me is an insult to Thomas Paine, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, you name it, whoever signed our Declaration and our Constitution. And that's an insult to the things I studied and loved about history and about constitutional law in a very good law school. So democracy still matters, freedom matters, press matters, ideas, good debate matters. We haven't seen that in a while, but we saw it in this last election, whether you like the results or not.
Yeah. And, up here in Canada, near $1 billion in federal subsidies to mainstream media in the last 5 years, and qualifications to receive these subsidies exclude any independent or any topic centric. So if you're not a generalist platform, you're somebody who just talks finance or just talks sports, meaning you're small and independent, you weren't eligible for these subsidies, and they were delivered under the guise of helping media adjust to a digital landscape. Now, can you believe that? 2020. If they haven't figured it out yet, like $1 billion isn't going to change that, right?
Yeah.
They're still trying to adjust to the internet. Is that what the mandate was? But that's how it was presented, that we need to help Canadian media stay competitive in a digital landscape. And it's like, man, there's no subsidies in the world that are going to help a platform catch up if they haven't figured that out in 2019.
Yeah.
And we're going to see change. And we got an election coming up in this country. I like that Trump is poking the prime minister. A lot of people that I talked to recently were like, 51st state, does that offend you? And I'm like, no, absolutely not. Pull him into the spotlight. Continue to call him out. This is really, really important. I mean, Canada rarely ever makes international headlines. We made a lot of them in the last 3 or 4 years, right? On the heel, and not good headlines, right?
No, it's true.
But we do have a lot of potential. I mean, it's a commodity exporter. We just need a deal. We need a dealman in that seat who just clears the path for the provinces to export and conduct business, remove bureaucracy. That's it. And that's what Prime Minister Harper did, right?
Yeah.
And we came through 2008 with a healthier balance sheet than any G7 nation because we're a huge country with nobody in it. It's a lot of potential here.
Yeah,
anyway.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. I totally agree. And look at Canada today, though. And again, you can. I think there's a direct correlation to Trudeau, but those who support Trudeau would disagree. But you can't disagree with the facts of your economy right now. You can't disagree with what's happening to your currency, what's happening to the cost of living. And you can't disagree with what you've done to your gold stores. I mean, I think you've been led by, when I was in grad school, you would go into a seminar in the first 10 minutes, you knew who the 3 or 4 smartest guys in the room were, gals and guys in the room. It was pretty obvious. You knew who the JV was on you're trying out for a baseball team, who was varsity, you knew in the first practice. And I look at guys like Trudeau and Macron, with all due respect, these are the guys that wouldn't even make the bench on the JV team, and they're leading the country. And so, and they're the guys that didn't read the books the day before class, and their conversation was meaningless. And you can tell, you can sniff that out if you're informed. And it's mediocrity, a sustained level of mediocrity in charge of the greatest nations in the world. And the result is what we're seeing today. Again, in Germany, coalitions breaking down. In France, Macron's a walking joke. In the UK, what's happening there. And certainly what's happening in Canada and what just happened in the U.S. The people are spoken. The people, again, whether they voted left or right, I've talked to Democrats and Republicans who are just fed up with their country, period, though. They are. And it becomes apolitical when you're in Toledo, Ohio, and you can't make rent and you can't afford even decent college or community college tuition, and you can't make your car payment. You become very political at that point. And so and these things are very, very real. When I look at the difference between Loudoun County, Virginia, and the polo fields there, or Park Avenue, New York, or Greenwich, Connecticut, or Martha's Vineyard, or Nantucket, and then you go into the real America, where that's in Louisiana or backwoods North. I mean, look, we couldn't come up with transformers for North Carolina after a hurricane. We were spending $200 billion on the Ukraine. Mm-hmm. People don't need to be left or right to be. This is disgusting. Yeah, I need a wage that keeps up with inflation. That's pretty apolitical, but very political. In other words, the people are really fed up. And some would say, well, when you're fed up, you're desperate, you'll vote for a maniac like Trump. No, I think they're voting for anything but what we've had in the last 4 years or beyond. they want to take some risks now. They'll try anything. And I think RFK Jr. is sincere. I think Tulsi Gabbard, I've spoken with her personally. I think she's sincere. She's a veteran. She's intelligent. She has immense integrity. She's not a Russian stooge, for God's sakes. And so, I've known some of these people. I think they're sincere. At the very least, they're sincere, and they're not stupid. Can they perform miracles? Again, goes with my point. Even the captain after the iceberg, the captain of the Titanic has a hell of a task when the water's coming in and there aren't enough lifeboats. You're going to have to make tough decisions. There's going to be sacrifices. Some people won't have a seat on the lifeboat. Even with immigration, when I was in law school, the first course we took was the defense of necessity. It was a true story about a lifeboat during World War I. A submarine hits a ship. People in the lifeboat have to throw people off a lifeboat, otherwise the lifeboat sinks. Is that murder? Because technically it meets the definition of murder. It's the intentional act to take a life. There's an act, there's an intent, and there's a consequence. But there's also a defense of necessity. And with immigration, which we're seeing, very politically incorrect thing to say, we're seeing it in Sweden, we're seeing it in Germany, we're seeing it in the UK, we're seeing it in France, we're certainly seeing it on our border in the US. Not every immigrant is a criminal, not every immigrant is here to do harm, but we can't absorb them. There is a defense of necessity. Enough is enough. We have to stop. We have to look at the criminal records of Sweden, for example, what immigrants have done to the crime rates in these countries. That shouldn't be racist or anti-immigrant. That should be nonpartisan. That should be a social geopolitical question with a debate and a policy and a reaction. And now if you go to Liverpool or Birmingham, or you go to a pub, or you go to a Kneipe in Frankfurt, and I go to these places because I live in Europe now, the racism is becoming open. They're just so fed up. Whether that's right or wrong is completely not the point. People are fed up. And I think a lot of Americans, when you have 13 to 19 trillion asylum seekers coming in, again, there's good and bad immigration policy, not just an open door. That, again, shouldn't be left or right. That should be debated in an informed, intelligent, reasonable way without being labeled a Nazi or a racist if you have a concern about crime rates or about letting just about anyone through the door. And you don't have to have a medical degree to be concerned about forced vaccinations, forced lockdowns, whether that is really democratic, whether that meets the ideals. And you don't have to be a constitutional lawyer to say, if I'm in the UK and I want to tweet something where my opinion is offensive, I can be arrested. That is not democracy. Democracy is messy. You have the right to say stupid things. You have the right to say really stupid things, but they're not criminal. It shouldn't be criminal to say what you think, unless it's inciting violence or libel or slander. There are rules, but we've gone so far towards centralization in these last 4 years across the country and across Europe. We've seen it from COVID to the media, to other policies, and frankly, even our foreign policy probably isn't led by the White House, but by other centralized forces in the shadows of the Pentagon and the cabinet. But I hope we can expose these things and discuss them openly. We'll see.
Yeah, I mean, you hit on it at the end there, and when we talk about free speech, I think it's important to think about what that really means, and it should mean that free speech means people you don't like are allowed to say things that you don't like as a blanket rule. Okay, and if anything inside of that is prohibited, that compromises the whole concept. I want to pull apart some of these campaign promises now, because you really hit on this. You're like, we've been promised deportation, we've been promised corrections to trade deals in the form of tariffs. Mm-hmm. We've been promised reshoring of industries. But simultaneously, reduction in inflation, and those things cannot coexist. No. So, what's your expectation here, Matthew?
I think Trump is going to do what he says, but he won't get everything he wants. And to your point, I absolutely agree. The things he wants to do are going to be inherently inflationary, and the only way we're going to see a victory against inflation in the backdrop of this type of spending and the types of costs of reshoring jobs or mass deportations or mass pink slips in DC or really painful tariffs. Again, I think tariffs in a dollar-centric world are going to fail, but regardless, it's going to be inflationary. And so the only way you could see disinflation would be a major market crash, which right now the markets are effectively centralized and Pavlovian and set up like a national 401k by the Fed, because if the Fed keeps rates down and promises lower rates and prints money out of thin air to the moon, you could argue deficits without tears or markets that only every dip is a recovery. But I think the only way we would see a disinflation or deflationary moment would be a major market crash and also a major recession. That would be disinflationary. But again, the solution to those type of crises, if we have a major recession, is going to be incredible fiscal spending largesse like we've never seen, like we saw post-COVID. If we have a market crash like 2008, we're going to see some version of direct or indirect QE, incredibly inflationary. So again, the policies are inflationary. The only disinflationary forces would be a market crash or a recession, and the only solution to a market crash or recession is mouse click money out of a central bank near you, which is inflationary. And frankly, even what's happening with Fed policy with rate cuts, all of these things are inflationary. So I think you're right. I don't think Trump's very political. You can't talk about inflation on a campaign trail. I think if you were Javier Milei, you could for a while because everyone was so desperate. You can afford to be real honest. Say, we're going to have some pain for a while. But I understand the politics of it. But I don't see how we avoid inflation, major currency debasement. Again, that's why, as Paul Tudor Jones said, all roads lead to inflation. And inflation is just another name for currency debasement. And that's why, many, many years ago, I saw the writing on this wall, in my opinion. And that's why I went from being a risk asset speculator to a boring physical gold wealth preservation stacker. It's not gold bugism. It's not hysteria. It's not gold only goes in one direction and gold solves all the problems. It certainly solves the inflation problem. And that inflation problem is so openly obvious to me, not just yesterday and today, but tomorrow as well, and for a long time. And like I said, any deflationary forces will be painful, and they'll be solved, quote unquote, solved with highly inflationary policies. I don't think whatever Elon does or Vivek does or Trump does to cut spending is going to solve that. The only other exception, again, would be if, and this is what Luke Gromen has said, and it probably will never happen, as he said, will never happen, but if they cut military spending by 40 to 50%, and if they cut entitlements, Social Security by 40 to 50%, I'd change my tune real fast if they could do that kind of radical cutting and spending, not just pink slips in DC. But again, given our military and given the politics of trying to kill those two major sources of sucking sounds of cost, I don't think Trump's ready to cut the military or entitlements at that level. I don't think Elon Musk is either, or Vivek. So you won't get all the promises made in the campaign, in my opinion. But I think he can make a dent and he can start a process. I hope the big part of his process is transparency and education. Talk to the people like you talk around a dinner table or a business meeting with your partners or your colleagues. You can't spend more than you make forever, and you can't solve that delta with counterfeit money that debases its inherent purchasing power without crushing the middle class. And the middle class, as Walt Whitman said, is the heart of a nation. And when you insult them, when you draft them and send them to foreign wars that politicians' sons don't fight, I'd like to see Bolton send himself to Iraq or Afghanistan or the Ukraine. I'd like to see Lindsey Graham in a trench somewhere. I would.
Sure.
But the middle class are always the first to go to Vietnam or to Iraq, and they're always the first to get crushed by inflation. I think government, if it cares about the real people, not just the top 10% and the lobbyists in the DNC and RNC big pockets, and I know a lot of these guys, if they care about the real country, they'll try to find a way not to debase the currency to the point where there's nothing left to these people to do. There's nothing left but to just suffer more. I mean, credit card delinquencies, car loan delinquencies are at all-time highs, 13-year peaks. Interest rates on credit cards for the middle class are 20, 21, 22%. To me, that's criminal. It's criminal. That's usury. And yet that, and again, I hate to say it, I drove from the polo fields of Virginia into the Rust Belt, and it's appalling, the wealth inequality. Houses, with broken windows and kids in the front yard. I mean, I'm not trying to be sensational, but get away from the glitter and the glamour and look at the real America. I talked to a kid yesterday who called me. He saw one of my podcasts. He was 25-year-old. He's an engineer. He lives in Columbus, Ohio. He makes $80,000 a year, him and his wife. And he was asking me, how can I buy gold? He's never going to be a client. But if I can talk to him for 30 minutes, I'm not saying that to be noble, but if I can talk to him, why can't our leaders talk to the whole population openly? about what you can and can't do, and listen. And I think RFK listens. I even think Trump listens. I think he's changed since he got shot in the head. I think he has. That doesn't mean he's perfect. I don't think anyone. I'm certainly not perfect. My God, there's a laundry list of mistakes, personal and private and financial. We all have them. We're all imperfect. But as John Kennedy said, we all breathe the same air. We all love our children. Whether you're in Jordan, whether you're in Syria, whether you're in Lebanon, whether you're in the Ukraine, whether you're in Russia, or whether you're in America or Argentina, I think that's true. But that's pretty fluffy and Pollyannish. But I think, we can talk to and listen to the middle class, who I think DC has ignored. And the irony is the Democrat Party, that is supposed to be about big government for the little guy, has left the little guy hanging more than any administration I've seen in a long time, this last 4 years. And I think when Trump's in Butler, Pennsylvania, and stands up with the flag behind him and blood on his head and raises his fist, that's an opportunity to get support. I hope he uses this opportunity to really take care of not the people who come to Mar-a-Lago, but the people in Toledo or Stevensville, Michigan, or Benton Harbor, Michigan. That's what I hope, or right on the border of Windsor in Detroit. That's what I hope.
Yeah, I hope you're right. And back on your inflation thesis, if all roads lead to inflation, people might go a few different directions with that. Some may say, okay, well, then I got to get out of cash and into assets. So maybe I'll look at the S&P, which is arguably more overvalued today than at any time in the history of the American Stock Exchange. So maybe that's not the smartest bet. Some will go there, though. Others will say, well, real estate, right? Well, okay. The average age of home buyers in the United States right now is 56 years old. So safe to say that's just out of reach for most people. And even new home buyers, if you get more granular, it's still like 37, right? Which is way up from 21 not that long ago, right? So continually further and further out of reach. So you have equities, you got real estate. Some will go to Bitcoin, right? It's a pretty volatile store of wealth. And I think you need a certain temperament and maybe a certain stage of life to really go all in as an inflation hedge on that asset class. I definitely got skin in that game, but by no means would I put my family's safety on it. You know what I mean? I just like having a horse in the race. So then you look at gold, right? Which is maybe where you and I probably land. But is my assessment of those four directions that people may go, do you think that's accurate? Have I missed anything, or my analysis of them, Matthew?
No, I talked about this 25-year-old from Columbus, Ohio, that I talked to yesterday. We were having the exact same conversation. He's 25 and he has a mortgage at 7% and he has a house. That's pretty impressive, because most 25-year-olds can't afford a new house. They can't get qualified for a loan. They can't buy real estate, and the interest rates are pretty painful. And it's a variable rate mortgage. And then we talked about, okay, you've got real estate. What about your stock portfolio? Well, he said, I'm not a gambler. I look at it and I understand that. That is, speculation is a casino. And we looked at Bitcoin. Of course, we looked at gold. So let's talk about, not just from his perspective, but you hit the main kind of allocation pathways. There's equities, of course, there's risk assets, stocks and bond portfolios, you could argue. There's Bitcoin or crypto. There's real estate. There's precious metals, hard assets. And we looked at those. Again, I'm not trying to make him a client. Our minimums are freaking 500,000 or 5 million in the vaults in Switzerland. So he's not, I'm not looking for his vote, but he represents what you're talking about. These are the choices facing the younger. Because look, before we even get into that, you have to understand, when you talk about, are we in a recession or are things good? Well, if you're 55 and older, you have over 120 trillion of the assets in America. You're doing pretty well. That generation did really well on low rates in the biggest boom and the biggest bubbles in history. But if you're under 55, it's not the same story. They don't have that kind of market kind of share of wealth. And you didn't get a mortgage, years ago when they were for free. And you didn't get them when real estate was cheaper and affordable in your 30s or 40s. This generation, my kids' generation, 27, 29, in this case 25, they're looking at a different menu. When I was that age, it was like the world was a menu. You could choose from it. Now it's a very small selection of opportunities. So in his case, he gets it. And he says, I just want to buy, I can't afford an ounce of gold. I can't afford a bar, but I can afford grams, or I can afford $100 or $200 a month. And he said, I choose that because I just want to protect the purchasing power. That's not the only thing you can do. And we talked, well, if inflation's coming and the S&Ps are ripping and you're getting higher returns in equities, that can outpace inflation. And it's true. If the markets continue to go up, you've got guys like Art Laffer with a cigar in his hand saying the S&P is going to 8,000. He says it with a straight face. Could be right, I still believe in Bob Farrell and mean reversion. I still believe in the madness of crowds with Charlie McKay. I still believe in Ben Graham. But I think these markets are completely divorced from the fundamentals. No one knows what the tipping point is going to be. They're completely overvalued. It's not a gold bug argument. Jeremy Grantham, Druckenmuller, Dalio, Gundlach, we all know they're overvalued. That doesn't mean they can't continue to be inflated on cheap rates and mouse click money. But to his point and to my point, that's a personal choice. You have to make a bet that the markets only go up, that they don't mean revert. And yeah, equities can outpace inflation. They can give you, in certain bonds, certainly give a better yield than gold that gives no yield. Certainly Bitcoin doesn't either. Or you can speculate to the moon with the most amazing speculation asset of our generation, not of all time, in Bitcoin. And then we can talk about Bitcoin, which we should. But between real estate, markets, and gold, and protecting yourself from currency debasement, my bias is obvious. It's physical gold, not because gold only goes up. But, look, it holds its value better than any other asset class in the world, and certainly better than Bitcoin. Bitcoin is many things, but the standard deviation over 160 and maximum drawdowns of 80%, that is not a store of value. That does not mean I'm making fun of Bitcoin. It doesn't mean Bitcoin's a joke. It just means that's not a store of value. Bitcoin has done a fantastic job, in my opinion, of hijacking the gold narrative as a store of value, as an anti-fiat alternative, as new or an anti-paper fiat money alternative or money. To me, money is a medium of exchange, a unit of account, and a store of value. And Bitcoin has not been those things, is not those things, and I don't think will be those things. That doesn't mean, despite the digital picture of a gold coin with a B on it, all the efforts they've done to kind of use the same narrative that gold uses about currency debasement and corrupt governments and monetary policies and what it's done to currencies. I still don't see even people in El Salvador buying things with Bitcoin. And I still don't see central banks stacking Bitcoin. I don't see Russia and China net settling their trades in Bitcoin. I don't see the BRICS talking about a Bitcoin Enbridge account down the road. It's still gold. And I don't see the BIS, love them or hate them, making Bitcoin a tier one asset. So we got to be honest. To me, Bitcoin is not digital gold. It is the speculation asset of the lifetime. People call it a tulip. Guys like Voorhees say tulips don't hit all-time lows, then all-time highs, then all-time lows, and then new highs. That's not a tulip. This is just a consolidation phase, and Bitcoin is going to have its day. Again, I don't think you can just mock Bitcoin either. It's many, many things, but it's not digital gold, and it's not, to me, a store of value. And to your point, what do younger people do? When I talk about wealth preservation at age 55 from the south of France with an office in Zurich, who wants to hear about that when you're 25? That doesn't speak to them. Because when I was 25, I wanted to make money, not preserve money. I had nothing to preserve when I'm 25. My kids, 27, 20, there's nothing to preserve. Don't talk about gold. Gold won't make me rich, and they're right. It won't make you rich. Bitcoin could. For 75% of the people, it makes them less rich. But that, I don't know if that's, I don't know. No one does. Michael Saylor, Voorhees, Mahlers will tell you differently. Smart guys like Larry Lepard and Ronnie Sturfel, who I completely admire and are smarter than me, are pro Bitcoin. So I'm not a Jim Rickards or Peter Schiff to just make Bitcoin investors think they're stupid. I think that's not right. The market cap of Bitcoin, the momentum of Bitcoin, and we should talk about the politicization of Bitcoin, makes it a pretty compelling argument right now. But I'm saying, let's just be clear, I don't think it's digital gold. I don't think it's a store of value. So if your goal in your 20s or 30s and you're a man on the street trying just to get some wealth that you can eventually preserve, you've got to try and take some risk. And so you've got to speculate. I speculated in my late 20s. That's how I was able to become a wealth preservation guy, because I speculated before. So it does no good to mock speculation. The problem I have is speculation is risky. You got to do your homework. Whether you're speculating in silver mines or gold mines or both, you've got to do your homework, because it's like Tucker said. I mean, look, the miners is just an example. They have the highest free cash flow in the S&P, but the lowest stock price because they're poorly managed. So if you're going to go long miners, they can be incredibly rewarding, but you better know their balance sheet. You better listen to guys like Frank Giustra, or Rick Rule, or Ross Beatty, the guys who do know this space. And even then there's risk. Unfortunately, there's no easy way to get rich in the markets if you don't do your homework. And even if you do your homework, it can be risky. So again, gold is not going to help you get rich when you're 25. And I understand how that's not an appeal. And so, but yet even this kid in Columbus, I just want to preserve what I have. That's his choice. Everyone is different. Everyone is different. I think there's a ton of tailwinds for Bitcoin right now. And this is something, and I think it's kind of ironic, but it shouldn't upset the Bitcoin crowd because I think it's a tailwind for Bitcoin as the speculation asset of a lifetime, if not an era, if not, again, history. Because again, you have a 5,000% move in 2013. You have an annualized return of 70%. Nothing beats Bitcoin for that type of return. Nothing. Right. So you can't mock that. You have to be aware of the risk. But, Voorhees, I remember listening to him a few months ago. Why do I own Bitcoin? Because I don't trust governments. I don't trust banks. I want to be decentralized and out of that system. I want privacy. I believe he's sincere. But look what's happening to Bitcoin now. You've got BlackRock and Fink. Fink hated Bitcoin 3 years ago. Now he can make a fortune off it. He loves it. He's centralizing it by making ETFs out of it. You've got a bill ready to go into the House and Senate, about making a Bitcoin stockpile, a strategic reserve. There is an interesting thing that Luke Groman came up with and Francis Hent came up with, and I was talking recently to Andy Schechtman about it. I didn't make this up. I can't take any credit for it, but it resonates with me. There's an interesting argument to be made that Bitcoin is being deliberately inflated. It's being deliberately centralized and deliberately politicized, which is the exact opposite of its original narrative, to be none of those things, to be apolitical and decentral. But what Luke Groman was saying, and Francis Hunt has picked up on too, remember, in the 1970s, America's coming out of Vietnam, we were in debt up to our ears like we are today, post-war. And Kissinger and his troop of spooks from the State Department and the CIA were going around the Gulf states saying, listen, guys, and this is public information now. This came out in 2010. Listen, guys, we're going to inflate oil. We've got a petrodollar now. We have a lot of debt in the U.S. We're going to inflate oil by 400% to help pay down our debt from Vietnam. And this is something that is not a conspiracy. This actually happened. It only came out many years later that they were artificially inflating oil to then pay down U.S. debt. And what Groman is catching on to, and what Francis Hunter catching on to, is Bitcoin is like it's like an entry drug. You inflate Bitcoin to get more purchases of stable coins. And stable coins like Tether are backed 85% by U.S. treasuries. So if you can make crypto sexy, and you can make crypto political, and you can make crypto centralized and part of the headlines and part of the narrative, then you can actually use that to mop up U.S. treasuries through stable coins, because then stable coins ride the wave of crypto and ride the wave of Bitcoin. And they're making the case that it's basically an entry drug for stable coins to legitimize stable coins so that we can reflate stable coins so that somebody besides the Fed is buying our U.S. treasuries. We live off of U.S. treasuries. We live off of issuing debt. We live off of Uncle Sam's IOUs. But since 2014, the world's been net dumping our U.S. treasuries and net stacking gold. We need someone besides the mouse clicker at the Eccles building to buy our own treasuries. And would it be interesting if we inflated crypto and stable coins as just another tool? Because we have so many tools of indirect QE. It's not just the Fed printing money. We have the reverse repo market, the TGA, what they're going to do with supplementary leverage ratios, wonky things to let banks basically do QE for the Fed. We've been issuing from the short end of the curve under Yellen. All these indirect ways to come up with liquidity. But now, if we can make a bubble out of crypto, that can absorb some U.S. treasuries. So there's a political motive behind the headlines. That may be wrong. It's not a kooky theory. It makes perfect sense. Hell, that's what I would do if I were desperate enough and I had Elon Musk on my cabinet or on my post and I had the headlines supporting this. It's ironic that it makes Bitcoin more political and more central when it was supposed to be none of those things, but it doesn't change the fact that that's a massive tailwind for Bitcoin. And if you want to speculate, don't fight the Fed, don't fight the government. If the government wants to inflate Bitcoin or cryptos, there's a great speculation opportunity there. Again, exit ramps could be legislated out. Moods could change. Policies could be changing. I don't know. No one does. As Egon famously said, Bitcoin can go to 1 million or zero. I think there's some truth to that. But again, I don't think you can laugh at Bitcoin. Its market cap is huge. I think the price is insane. It makes no sense to me on a rational level. And despite all the arguments, it's not a unit of account. It's not a medium of exchange. It's not a store of value. and all the things I explained, it's not really being used by the BRICS or anyone else. But their argument is 20 years from now in a digital world, it's a digital asset. You got to follow history. You got to go with it. Pet rocks like gold are from the time immemorial. Old fogies like me don't understand it. We would argue that young kids like Mahlers don't understand gold, but who cares? We could both be right. We could both be wrong. It's a pointless debate. One is a preservation asset. One is a speculation asset. You're not comparing oranges and tangerines. You're comparing apples and oranges, in my opinion. Long way of saying Bitcoin, real estate, equities, gold. Those are four choices. The choices have to be made based on where you are in your life and who you are as your profile. Are you a speculator, a gambler? Are you good at it? If you are, speculate at your own risk and God be with you. That's how I made money, by accident with a lottery ticket on a pre-IPO during a dot-com bubble. If I had made it in a crypto bubble, I wouldn't apologize for that either. I was just in Frankfurt. A guy in his late 30s bought Bitcoin at $400. You got to give him credit for holding on. I would have sold at $1,000. So if he's making hundreds and hundreds of millions in his 30s because he took risk on Bitcoin, I give him full credit. That takes incredible courage and conviction. And it certainly isn't make him an idiot. But what did he say to me? And this is just one example. I got to sell some of this Bitcoin and put it into gold to preserve what I've made. Because when I made money on a pre-IPO in my late 20s, I knew it was a lottery ticket. I wasn't pretending it was strong fundamentals. In fact, the stock, it was called Commerce One. It reverse merger went to zero after it went up millions. So, I mean, my stock, but I got out. I was lucky, but I knew it was a bubble. I think Bitcoin is too, but it's a bubble could last for years and you could ride it. But what this young man was doing was, I'm going to sell some of my Bitcoin and put it into gold because I do want to preserve some of my wealth. But again, if you're 29 and you can't get through the month and you're trying to build it in the markets through investing, tread carefully, know what you're doing, and just call a duck a duck. It's speculation. Gold is not a speculation asset. So again, I don't think it's healthy to even have the debate. I think it's clear to know what they are. They're different things. I think it makes no sense to insult crypto investors. I think there's some real smart ones. They know what they are. They're speculators. I think it makes no sense to insult gold as some outdated pet rock. It's not. And again, not yesterday, not today, and not tomorrow. And again, the reason the BRICS are looking entirely at gold, and the reason they're net settling oil trades in gold, and the reason the BIS made it the only other tier one asset besides that 10-year U.S. Treasury from Uncle Sam, that's not a gold bug case. That's objective evidence that the world would rather save in gold and spend in fiat. And it's objective evidence that the world, 50% of the world, the BRICS have 50% of the population, 50% of the natural resources, if not more, they'd rather have gold than a U.S. Treasury. And trust me, China would much rather buy oil in ounces of gold rather than stacks of dollar bills. And that is the new direction. It's not going to happen overnight. The petrodollar is not dead yet. It's a long time off. But the clear direction of that hockey puck is oil net settled outside of the petrodollar, slow and steady, not overnight. You can't deleverage the dollar that quickly. That's a run on the bank. Saudi Arabia knows it. The UAE knows it. China knows it. But the clear indications from the BRICS meetings in South Africa and Kazan is we are slowly turning our back on the US dollar. Not going to replace it with the yuan or the ruble. We're not going to kill it. We don't want to see it killed. The UAE and Saudi Arabia are pegged to the dollar. They're not going to kill the dollar. They're just going to reprice it. And so all these things are happening. They shouldn't be sensational. The fighting about the gold versus the DXY, fighting about gold versus Bitcoin is really fighting of abstractions. They're totally different conversations. And not one of them is smarter or dumber than the other. But what we can see is the world is in debt. It doesn't have enough tax receipts and productivity to pay that debt. They're going to fill that delta with money created out of thin air or inflationary policies, short of some global kumbaya Plaza Accord 2.0 or Bretton Woods 2.0, where we all get together and forgive each other's debt, and it's a big debt jubilee. Good luck in the world we live in today doing that. So I'm just playing the probabilities here, and that's how I look at it.
Yeah, can't see that in. It's not like there's no division today, though, Matthew. Right? People seem to get along pretty well.
Yeah, everything's great.
I really appreciate your comments on Bitcoin because I completely agree. And I don't know if it's just on my screen, but my camera is suddenly completely blown out. So if I'm super blurry with you, I don't know. I tried to troubleshoot when you were talking. I don't know what happened. It's okay. We're at the end of the hour. It's gonna be fine. Okay. But I think it's just a very important message that you shared, that there's a very attractive speculation opportunity. But you said something in the middle. You're like, there's no easy way to get rich. And that's the problem I have with that culture from some of the pundits within it, is that it is that easy. It's this easy. Just buy this and go to bed. Right. And some of the more sensational pundits are giving, I think, very damaging advice. Right. Mortgage your house, buy Bitcoin, for example. Don't do that. Don't do that. Don't do that. No. Terrible advice. If there was, maybe it's different this time than it's ever been in the history of wealth creation, that now there is suddenly a vehicle available to everybody and it is that easy to get rich. But I doubt it. I don't think that's the case. So tread carefully, participate, but just be aware. That's all. Be aware. That's all.
All right. Absolutely. Be informed. Be a big boy. Be a big girl. Don't fall for easy. But I say that as a hypocrite because the pre-IPO I got in through a Goldman Sachs underwritten IPO that I didn't do any homework on made me a lottery ticket winner at 28, 29. So I'm very humble about that. But I also, I know guys who bought Bitcoin real cheap and they're pretty humble. Don't just because you make money or because your stock price tells you that you're rich doesn't mean you're smart. Be honest. There's a difference, especially in an asset class like that. But once you have wealth, it's a high class problem. Then you got to understand how to keep it. And I've learned this from my family office days and from being around a lot of wealthy people my whole life. I was the baseball scholarship kid from Michigan, went to prep school in the Ivy Leagues, on scholarships. But I was around rich people my whole life. And what did their dads teach me? If you want to get rich, the secret to staying rich is not losing what you have. That doesn't mean it's only gold. But you got to keep your money. I've seen the big joke in the family office. The easiest way to make a small fortune is to inherit a large fortune. If you have money, whether you've earned it, whether you won it by hook or crook, whether you inherit it or whether you made it the old-fashioned way and really built something and had a service and a product that made the world better, which is far more noble than speculating, in my opinion. But if you've got money, it's your responsibility to be informed about how to preserve it, how to invest it, how to safeguard it. Gold is one obvious way. It's not the only way. And if you want to speculate or invest in really good money managers, there's not many. There's very few. Trust me, I've been through hundreds of them. There are very few actually do it well. But it's your job to then have the high-class problem of informing yourself and don't fall for carpet salesmen who can just tell you it's easy. Don't ever mortgage your house for any asset that you're speculating in. That's insanity. It's insanity. And yet, my kids think, my son in particular, my daughter is at Goldman Sachs. She's a little more reasonable. My son's a speculator. He feels like he's not successful enough. He's not a millionaire at 30 because you hear the Zuckerbergs of the must. You think that's normal. That is not normal. That is not normal. There was a great joke, and I'll end on this, during the dot-com bubble in the 90s when I was a young Turk, an idiot, didn't know a stock from a bond, and I could look at my ATM receipts. I'm not bragging. It was a joke. But there were a lot of young 20-somethings making ridiculous money at Montgomery Securities or Robbie Stevens, and the whole era of the dot-com bubble it was the Bitcoin at the time. It was the easy money, the pre-IPO money. There was a great joke after the markets crashed in 2001. I remember it well, April 14th. Just the beginning of the end for the NASDAQ. NASDAQ, by the way, is a PE ratio today of 49. That's insanity. It reminds me a lot of the Cisco, Lucent, Qualcomm bubble of 2000, just like we're seeing in the video. But there was a lot of 20-somethings making millions of dollars. That was normalized. But there was a great commercial, and it was in 2001. And it was a car, like a Subaru, going over the Golden Gate Bridge with like a Vermont license plate with a bunch of surfboards and skis on top, and said, "Last year you were 28 and a millionaire. This year, you're just 29," and people were leaving the city because the bubble had popped. It was over. The tulips were done, and there was that little window. It was pure, as Malcolm Gladwell would say, luck of your birth certificate, luck of your timing. And right now, for some, Bitcoin is that. And I do not laugh at it. I do not mock the people who are proud of their winnings or hoping for more, but just, if you're going to say Bitcoin is not a bubble, that it's new money, okay, that I don't agree, but you could be right. Think of that real carefully. Don't sucker people into that if you don't believe it. If you do believe it, make a strong case for it. Mahlers and Voorhees and others would. Metcalfe's Law, all of that. But I personally don't. It doesn't mean I'm right. But if you're going to risk everything on that, you should be very comfortable and very conviction based on that. I had no conviction about the NASDAQ when it was a bubble. I knew it was a bubble. I knew it was. Be honest with yourself. And gold doesn't go straight up either. It just doesn't, but it's safe. It's not sexy. It doesn't attract the millennials for that reason. And it probably wouldn't have attracted me at 26 if I was trying to buy that quote unquote Porsche by 30. But,
Sure.
you know, the Porsche is just a car. That new car smell goes away. The biggest house is just a house. Eventually, all of that fun wears off and you're stuck asking what is real wealth. That's a more philosophical question. It's not just money. Certainly, as Frank Sinatra said, being rich, I've been poor and I've been rich, and rich is better. Of course, when you're stressed about mortgages and groceries, money matters. But after a certain point, it doesn't at all. And that sounds very Pollyannish and condescending, but nah. Friends, family, your dog, your moments, your memories, those are real wealth. So don't risk that kind of sanity on speculation, and just be mature about it.
I love it, man. Look, always great chatting with you. I'm looking forward to seeing you in person. If you guys want to meet Matthew in person, if you want to see me more clearly, come to the Vancouver Resource Investment Conference, January 19th to 20th. There's a link right beneath this video where you can check out tickets. Matthew, you were there last year. This year, we're joined by another several dozen amazing keynote speakers: Danielle DiMartino Booth, David Rosenberg, Grant Williams, Robert Kiyosaki, Rick Rule, Ross Beatty, a couple of the names we mentioned today, and dozens more. Frank Justra, several of the names we mentioned today. But, there's about 80 keynote speakers. It's 2 days jam-packed full of wealth preservation and wealth creation, in this chaotic world, conversations just like this and many, many more. So looking forward to having you back in Vancouver. Yeah. And until then, man, stay well and have a great holiday season.
You too, Jay. I'm looking forward to seeing you soon. It'll be great.